Carl Jung discovered something that will shatter everything you thought you knew about being an empath. After decades of studying patients who possessed extraordinary sensitivity, Jung found that empaths don't fail at relationships because they care too much. They fail because modern society has weaponized their gifts against them, turning their greatest strength into a prison of codependency. Right now, you might be exhausted from absorbing everyone's emotions. You might feel guilty for wanting to set boundaries. You might believe that being a good person means sacrificing yourself for others. But Jung discovered that this isn't empathy at all. It's what he called the collective shadow playing out through your nervous system, and it's destroying you from the inside. Here's what's at stake. Your entire identity as an empath might be built on a lie. The traits you've been told make you special, the sensitivity you've been praised for, the self-sacrifice you've been taught to embrace. Jung found that these aren't signs of spiritual advancement. They're symptoms of what he called the hero-martyr complex, a psychological trap that keeps you codependent, exhausted, and unable to access your true power. But here's what makes Jung's research so revolutionary. He didn't just identify the problem. He mapped the entire psychological architecture of empathic codependency and discovered the precise process for dismantling it. Jung called this process individuation, but what he was really describing was a complete psychological rebirth that transforms empaths from emotional sponges into what I call radically sovereign beings. These are people who feel deeply without losing themselves, who give generously without depleting themselves, who love fully without abandoning themselves. They've learned to alchemically transmute their sensitivity from a wound into a weapon, from a liability into their greatest source of power. Think about what your life would look like if you could walk into any room and sense the emotional undercurrents without becoming responsible for managing them. Imagine having relationships where you can witness someone's pain without making it your mission to fix them. Picture yourself setting boundaries without the crushing guilt that currently paralyzes you every time you choose yourself over someone else's comfort. This isn't fantasy. This is what Jung discovered was possible when empaths complete the individuation process. But most empaths never even begin this journey because they've been convinced that their codependency is actually compassion, that their lack of boundaries is actually love, that their self-sacrifice is actually spiritual. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your empathy has been killing you, and more importantly, how to reclaim it as the superpower it was always meant to be. You'll learn the specific psychological mechanisms that trap empaths in codependent patterns, the unconscious programming that makes you believe your worth depends on how much you can give, and the alchemical process Jung identified for transforming wounded empathy into radical self-sovereignty. But I need to warn you, this information will make it impossible to go back to your old patterns. Once you see the psychological truth behind your codependency, you can't unsee it. Once you understand how you've been programmed to sacrifice yourself, you can't unknow it. This journey requires courage, because choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else feels like betrayal, even though it's actually liberation. But let's not pretend this journey will be comfortable. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But for empaths, becoming who you truly are means destroying who you've been taught to be. And that process feels like death. Most empaths live in what Jung identified as the collective unconscious trap. Society didn't just teach you to be sensitive. It programmed you to believe that your worth depends on how much you can give, how much you can heal, how much pain you can absorb from others. This isn't conscious teaching. It's what Jung called shadow programming, operating beneath your awareness, transmitted through generations like a psychological virus. Think about how you learned to be an empath. Maybe you grew up in a chaotic household where you became the emotional regulator, sensing tension before it exploded and managing everyone's feelings to keep the peace. Maybe you were praised for being understanding when you suppressed your own needs to accommodate others. Maybe you were told you were special because you could feel what others felt, which really meant you were useful for managing emotions that adults couldn't handle themselves. Jung discovered that empaths often develop in environments where emotional labor is demanded, but not reciprocated. You learned that love equals sacrifice, that boundaries equal selfishness, that your needs are less important than others' comfort. These weren't lessons taught through words. They were encoded into your nervous system through repeated experiences where your value was measured by your usefulness, where your lovability was contingent on your ability to manage others' emotional states. This is what Jung meant by the collective shadow. These aren't personal failures or individual wounds. They're cultural patterns, societal programming that gets passed down unconsciously from parent to child, from teacher to student, from society to individual. The collective has a vested interest in creating empaths who sacrifice themselves because it benefits everyone except the empath. You became the emotional shock absorber for your family, your friend group, your workplace. People learned they could dump their unprocessed emotions on you, and you would not only accept them, but transform them, like some kind of psychological waste management system. And you accepted this role because you were taught it was noble, spiritual, loving. But Jung understood something that changes everything about this dynamic. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. He discovered that this pattern isn't sustainable because it violates a fundamental law of psychological energy. Energy must flow in cycles, not one direction. When you constantly give without receiving, when you absorb without releasing, when you hold space for everyone except yourself, you create what Jung called a libido dam. Psychological energy gets blocked, backing up into your system, creating anxiety, depression, physical illness, and eventually, complete burnout. This is why you're exhausted. Not because you're weak, not because you're doing it wrong, but because you're operating against the fundamental laws of psychological health. And the solution isn't to try harder, give more, or develop better coping mechanisms. The solution is to dismantle the entire codependent structure and build something radically different in its place. Here's where Jung's research gets disturbing. He found that empaths aren't born codependent. They're systematically trained into codependency through what he called the hero archetype gone wrong. Let me explain what this means and why it's one of the most brilliant insights in all of depth psychology. Jung identified the hero as one of the fundamental archetypes in human psychology. The healthy hero archetype operates like this. You embark on a journey of self-discovery. You face challenges that force you to confront your shadow. You integrate what you've rejected about yourself, and you return transformed, bringing wisdom back to your community. This is the monomyth, the hero's journey that appears in every culture's mythology. But empaths get trapped in what I call the hero-martyr mutation, where the journey never ends, the challenges are always external, and the transformation never comes because you're focused on transforming everyone except yourself. You've been convinced that your purpose is to save others, to heal the wounded, rescue the broken, fix the damaged. This sounds noble, spiritual even. Society celebrates this pattern. You're called caring, compassionate, selfless. You receive validation for your sacrifice, praise for your emotional labor, recognition for your capacity to endure pain that would break most people. But Jung understood that this pattern isn't about helping others. It's about avoiding yourself. And this is where his insight becomes uncomfortable, because it exposes the shadow side of empathic codependency that nobody wants to acknowledge. Every moment you spend fixing someone else's problems is a moment you don't have to face your own. Every hour you invest in someone else's healing is an hour you can avoid your own pain. Every relationship where you play therapist is a relationship where you don't have to risk being seen in your own vulnerability, where you maintain power through being the helper rather than face the terror of being the one who needs help. Jung called this psychological bypassing through service. You use helping others as a sophisticated defense mechanism against dealing with your own unprocessed trauma, your own shadow material, your own need for love, attention, and care. The helper role becomes a prison disguised as purpose. And here's the most painful truth that Jung documented extensively in his clinical work. The people you're trying to save don't actually want to be saved. They want to use your empathy as an emotional crutch, a place to deposit their unprocessed feelings without doing their own inner work. Meanwhile, you slowly dissolve into resentment and exhaustion, wondering why your sacrifice is never enough, why your love doesn't transform them, why they keep making the same destructive choices despite everything you've given. This is why your relationships follow the same pattern, and you need to hear this, even though it's going to sting. You meet someone who seems broken, wounded, in need of the unique understanding only you can provide. You feel that familiar pull, that sense of purpose, that conviction that this time will be different, because you've learned so much, you've grown so much, you finally understand how to love correctly. You pour your energy into them, convinced that your empathy will heal them, that your love will transform them, that your sacrifice will finally be appreciated. You tolerate behavior you would never accept from others, because you tell yourself you see their potential, you understand their pain, you know who they could become if they just had someone who truly believed in them. But it never works. Because codependent relationships aren't built on genuine connection. They're built on unconscious contracts where you agree to manage their emotions in exchange for feeling needed, important, special. You get to avoid your own inner work by focusing on theirs. They get to avoid responsibility for their healing by outsourcing it to you. It's a perfect dysfunctional system that serves everyone's shadow needs while destroying everyone's authentic growth. Jung understood that until empaths face this uncomfortable truth, they remain trapped in an endless cycle of rescuing, resenting, and repeating. The same dynamic with different faces, the same pain with different names, the same exhaustion with different justifications. If you've recognized yourself in this pattern and you're ready to face it honestly, comment, "I see the pattern now." But Jung discovered something that changes everything about codependency. And this insight is so profound that it revolutionized not just how we understand empaths, but how we understand the entire structure of human emotional experience. He found that empaths aren't actually feeling other people's emotions. They're feeling their own disowned emotions, projected onto others. This sounds counterintuitive because your entire experience as an empath contradicts this statement. But stay with me, because understanding this mechanism is the key to your liberation. When you walk into a room and immediately sense tension, you believe you're picking up on everyone else's unspoken feelings. But Jung's research revealed something more complex and more fascinating. You're actually sensing the resonance between their unexpressed emotions and your own suppressed feelings. You're not an emotional sponge absorbing external energy. You're a tuning fork, vibrating in response to frequencies that match your own unintegrated material. This is why certain people drain you more than others. It's not because they're more toxic or more needy. It's because their unconscious patterns match your shadow material, the parts of yourself you've rejected and refused to acknowledge. They're walking mirrors reflecting back, aspects of yourself that you've buried so deeply you don't even recognize them as yours. Let me illustrate this with a composite case profile based on patterns Jung observed repeatedly in his clinical work. Consider an empath who became physically ill whenever around angry people. This person believed they were absorbing others' rage, that their sensitivity made them vulnerable to negative emotions in their environment. But through analytical work following Jung's framework, something shocking emerged. This person was actually terrified of their own anger. They had grown up in an environment where anger was dangerous, where expressing rage led to punishment or abandonment. So they buried their anger so deeply that they couldn't access it consciously, convinced themselves they simply weren't an angry person. But the psyche doesn't eliminate what we reject. It doesn't delete our rage, our selfishness, our destructive impulses just because we decide they're unacceptable. Jung understood that rejected material goes into what he called the shadow, where it continues to exist with full psychological power, but now it operates outside our conscious awareness and control. So what happens when someone with buried rage encounters another person expressing anger openly? Their body reacts violently, not because they're absorbing external negativity, but because they're encountering a part of themselves they've refused to integrate. The other person's anger isn't poisoning them, it's reflecting their disowned rage back to them, and their system is reacting to the internal conflict of meeting a rejected part of themselves. This is the revolution Jung offered empaths. Your sensitivity isn't the problem. Your lack of boundaries with your own shadow is the problem. You haven't learned to distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to others because you haven't fully claimed what belongs to you in the first place. Think about the emotions that drain you most when you encounter them in others. Anger, neediness, selfishness, manipulation. These aren't random. They're precise maps to your shadow territory, showing you exactly which parts of yourself you've rejected and now encounter as external threats. The truly skilled empath, the individuated empath that Jung described, has integrated their shadow material. They've claimed their anger, acknowledged their needs, accepted their selfishness, recognized their capacity for manipulation, not because these qualities are good or should be expressed without restraint, but because owning them consciously is the only way to prevent them from controlling you unconsciously. When you integrate your shadow, something remarkable happens. You can be around angry people without becoming ill because you're no longer in conflict with your own anger. You can witness neediness without feeling drained because you've accepted your own needs. You can observe manipulation without being triggered because you've acknowledged your own capacity for it. This is what Jung meant by psychological integration, and this is the foundation of radical self-sovereignty for empaths. Jung identified specific archetypal patterns that empaths must integrate to break free from codependency. Understanding these archetypes is crucial because they represent fundamental psychological structures that exist in every human psyche, but empaths interact with them in uniquely dysfunctional ways that perpetuate their codependent patterns. The first archetypal system is what Jung called the anima and animus, the inner masculine and feminine principles that exist in everyone regardless of biological gender. Jung understood these not as literal gender traits, but as complementary psychological functions that must work in balance. For psychological health, the anima represents the receptive principle, the capacity to feel, receive, nurture, flow, accommodate, connect. The animus represents the assertive principle, the capacity to act, protect, direct, structure, discriminate, separate. Both are essential, both are powerful, both must be integrated, but empaths typically over-identify with receptive qualities while rejecting assertive qualities. You've developed an extraordinary capacity to feel everything, receive everyone's emotions, nurture everyone's needs, flow with everyone's energy, accommodate everyone's preferences, and connect with everyone's pain. Meanwhile, you've underdeveloped your capacity to act on your own behalf. Protect your energy, direct your attention consciously, structure appropriate boundaries, discriminate between healthy and unhealthy relationships, and separate yourself from others' emotional states. This creates profound psychological imbalance. You can feel everything, but do nothing about it. You can sense harm, but can't protect yourself from it. You can absorb pain, but can't transmute it into wisdom. You can open to everyone, but can't close to anyone. You're all receptivity with no assertion, all feeling with no action, all flow with no structure. Jung discovered that this imbalance doesn't just make you codependent, it actually makes you dangerous, both to yourself and to others, because underdeveloped assertion doesn't disappear. It goes underground, becoming what Jung called shadow assertion. This manifests as passive aggression, manipulation through guilt, emotional blackmail disguised as care, resentment that poisons relationships from within, and eventually, explosive rage when your suppressed boundaries finally breach. Radical self-sovereignty requires integrating both principles. You must learn to receive and assert, to open and close, to give and protect, to feel and act. This isn't about becoming hard or losing your sensitivity. It's about developing what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the ability to distinguish between self and other, between your feelings and their feelings, between compassion and codependency, between love and fusion. When you integrate assertive energy consciously, you develop the capacity to feel someone's pain without making it your mission to fix. You can witness suffering without absorbing it into your body. You can offer support without taking responsibility. You can love someone while maintaining clear, energetic boundaries that protect both of you from the toxic fusion that codependency creates. The second archetypal pattern empaths must face is what Jung called the child archetype, specifically the wounded child who still lives in your psyche, making unconscious decisions based on decades-old programming. This wounded child learned that being needed equals being loved, that fixing others equals being valuable, that absorbing pain equals being good. These lessons weren't taught through words, but through experiences where your emotional labor was rewarded with attention, where your sensitivity was praised because it made you useful, where your capacity to manage chaos made you indispensable. The wounded child is still operating in your adult relationships, though you don't recognize its voice because it sounds like you. When you feel guilty for setting a boundary, that's the wounded child speaking, terrified that protecting yourself means you'll be abandoned. When you compulsively check on people who hurt you, that's the wounded child speaking, believing that if you just try hard enough, they'll finally see your worth. When you tolerate mistreatment while telling yourself you're being understanding, that's the wounded child speaking, confusing love with endurance. Jung's process of individuation requires consciously parenting this wounded child, not through inner child work that coddles and validates, but through what Jung called integration. You must give this part of yourself the security, the unconditional love, the stable attachment it never received, so it stops running your adult relationships from a place of childhood terror. This means learning to soothe yourself when you feel the panic of potential abandonment, instead of immediately people-pleasing to prevent it. It means choosing yourself even when the wounded child screams that you're being selfish. It means recognizing that the love you're chasing in others is the love you must first give yourself. But here's what makes this work so challenging. The wounded child doesn't want to heal. It wants to be rescued. It's still waiting for the parent who will finally see it, the partner who will finally choose it, the friend who will finally prioritize it. Individuation requires grieving the rescue that's never coming and becoming your own secure base. When you complete this archetypal integration, when you balance receptive and assertive energies and heal the wounded child's control over your choices, you develop what Jung called inner authority. This is an unshakable sense of self that doesn't depend on external validation, approval, or need. You no longer require others to be broken so you can feel valuable. You no longer need to fix people to prove your worth. You no longer sacrifice yourself to earn love, because you've finally learned that real love doesn't require sacrifice. If you're starting to see how these archetypal patterns have been controlling your relationships, comment, "I'm integrating my wholeness." Here's where Jung's framework reaches its most intense point, and this is where most empaths turn back because the process becomes so uncomfortable that it feels unbearable. But Jung understood that empaths cannot gradually reduce codependency. They cannot slowly adjust their way out of these patterns. They must alchemically transform it through what he called the nigredo, the blackening phase where your old identity dies completely. Jung studied alchemy extensively, not because he believed in turning lead into gold, but because he recognized alchemical texts as symbolic maps of psychological transformation. The nigredo is the first and most terrifying stage, where the prima materia, your original psychological substance, must be completely dissolved before it can be reconstituted into something new. For empaths, this means there will be a period where everything you've built your identity on crumbles. You will feel selfish for having boundaries because the wounded child will scream that you're abandoning everyone. You will feel guilty for prioritizing yourself because decades of programming tells you that your worth depends on your usefulness to others. You will be terrified that if you stop managing everyone's emotions, they'll abandon you, proving your deepest fear that you're only lovable when you're needed. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, and it's not a sign that you're failing. It's evidence that you're finally dismantling the codependent structures that have imprisoned you. The old empath must die, so the sovereign empath can be born. This death isn't metaphorical or symbolic. It's psychological death that feels as real as physical death. You will grieve the loss of your people-pleasing self, the version of you that everyone found safe and convenient. You will mourn relationships that can't survive your transformation because they were built on your willingness to sacrifice yourself. You will face the terror of existing without the validation that came from being needed, the praise that came from being useful, the sense of purpose that came from fixing others. Jung warned that many people abort this process prematurely because the discomfort becomes too intense. They convince themselves they've taken it too far. They're becoming cold or uncaring. They miss who they used to be. But returning to codependency after glimpsing sovereignty is a special kind of hell, because now you know you're choosing your prison. But on the other side of this alchemical death, Jung discovered something extraordinary emerges. What he called the individuated self, a version of you that can feel deeply without losing yourself, give generously without depleting yourself, love fully without abandoning yourself. This isn't theory. This is documented psychological transformation that Jung witnessed repeatedly in patients who had the courage to complete the process. This sovereign empath operates from what Jung termed inner authority, an unshakable sense of self that doesn't depend on external validation, approval, or need. You no longer require others to be broken, so you can feel valuable because your value is intrinsic, not earned through service. You no longer need to fix people to prove your worth, because your worth isn't contingent on outcomes you can't control. You no longer sacrifice yourself to earn love, because you've finally learned that real love doesn't require sacrifice. It requires presence, boundaries, and the courage to be fully yourself. Jung found that individuated empaths develop what I call conscious empathy, and this is radically different from the codependent empathy you've been practicing. You can sense others' emotions without making them your responsibility. You can witness suffering without trying to rescue. You can hold space for pain without absorbing it into your body. You can feel someone struggle without believing it's your job to solve it for them. This isn't cold detachment. It's radical compassion that recognizes the most loving thing you can do is allow others to face their own darkness while you tend to your own light. You understand that rescuing someone from their consequences doesn't help them grow. It keeps them dependent and keeps you depleted. The sovereign empath has learned that true service comes from overflow, not obligation. You give because you want to, not because you have to. You help because it aligns with your values, not because you need to be needed. You love because someone earned your trust, not because you're trying to earn theirs. Carl Jung spent his life studying the human psyche, and he understood that empaths aren't here to sacrifice themselves for others. You're here to model what integrated sensitivity looks like, to demonstrate that depth and boundaries can coexist, to prove that feeling everything doesn't mean fixing everything. The era of the codependent empath is ending. The rise of the radically sovereign empath has begun, and it starts with you choosing yourself as ferociously as you've chosen everyone else. But this choice isn't made once. It's made every day, in every interaction, every time you feel the old pull toward codependency and choose differently. You'll make this choice when someone tries to make their emotions your responsibility, and you compassionately decline. You'll make this choice when you feel guilty for having needs, and you honor them anyway. You'll make this choice when someone accuses you of being selfish for having boundaries, and you hold those boundaries with love. Jung understood that psychological transformation isn't a destination, it's a practice. Every moment of consciousness, every choice for authenticity, every decision to respond from sovereignty rather than codependency, builds the psychological structure of your individuated self. Your sensitivity was never the problem. Your lack of boundaries with your own shadow was the problem. Your empathy was never a weakness. Your belief that you had to sacrifice yourself to express it was the weakness. Your capacity to feel deeply was never too much. The world's inability to handle depth was too little. You are not here to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You are not here to manage everyone's emotions so they don't have to grow. You are not here to prove your worth through endless giving. You are here to be fully yourself, boundaries and all depth and discrimination, empathy and assertion, completely integrated and radically sovereign. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.